In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how I pick up stitches around a neckline. In this case, it's a crew neckline, so that's what we'll be talking about today, so a rounded neckline here. You'll notice I have little stair-step segments here across the neck where I did all these different bind-offs to create that wide neckline that comes up slowly. I have a flat section here where I just have rows on each side, and then across the back of the neck I have bound-off stitches. All right, and we'll be talking about all of that as I pick up. So here we go. I like to start on the back of my sweater, typically at the back right shoulder, the right shoulder being as you wear it. Okay, I'm going to start right after the seam, and I'm going to pick up just right here in this very first stitch that looks like a letter V. I'm going to stab my needle into that letter V. So notice I'm not going underneath the bound off edge like this. I'm actually going below the bound off edge into the very first clean looking stitch. Then I wrap my yarn around my needle as though I'm knitting. So I am a continental knitter, I wrap with my left hand. If you are an English knitter, you will wrap this way, the same way you would for knitting. And what you're going to do across here, across the back of the sweater, is pick up one stitch for every stitch that you bound off. So I'm going into each column that looks like a little letter V. That's not every hole, it's every column. So I insert my needle into the V and I pull up a stitch. All right, so that's what I'm going to do across the back neck. The back neck had no depth, it was just a straight bind off. So I'm picking up straight across. It'll get exciting again once I hit the seam. So for now, I'm just picking up one stitch for every column that looks like a letter V as in Victor. Okay. So here it's one stitch for every stitch. Alrighty. I don't know what happened there. Got a little funny looking. Okay, so here we go. I'm at my seam now. I picked up one stitch for every stitch across the back neck. If you had a number in your pattern telling you how many stitches that was supposed to be, that's how many stitches you should have here. So if your back neck said bind off remaining 20 stitches, you would now have 20 stitches up here. So now I'm here at the seam, the shoulder seam, and my stitches have changed direction. I now have rows from here to here rather than bound off stitches. So I'm going to go into the very first clean looking column of stitches along the edge here. I'm going to pick up 3 stitches, 1, 2, 3 for every 4 rows. That means I'm going to skip this row. 1, 2, 3. Skip a row. 1, 2, 3. And here where I would normally skip, the next place I'd be going into is a really large hole, so I'm actually not going to skip that 4th one. So you can fudge a little bit here. What I'm also going to do is count these stitches. I have 10. From my shoulder seam to the first bound off stitch here, for my neckline, I have 10 stitches. And just keep that number in mind because we're going to replicate that on the other side of the neck. Now I'm going to turn a little bit just for effect. I usually don't turn, I just keep going. But here we go. I've turned a little bit and now I'm going to be picking up across these stair steps on the sweater. The concept here is the same as the back neck. I'm going to be picking up one stitch for every bound off stitch, one stitch for every column that looks like a letter V. So my first one is right here. You want to avoid big holes. Going into them will only make them bigger. So I'm going in, wrapping my yarn around and pulling it up. Now my next V column is over here. So I'm in this one. I'm going to jump over one and pick up here. So this is how I get down the stair steps. I focus on whatever the column of the stitch looks like, and I grab the uppermost V on that column. So here I was in this column. Now I'm jumping over a stair step. My next column is this one. I'm going to pick up right here. So I'm picking up one stitch for every bound off stitch. I'm not going into any large holes, like where those stair steps meet. I'm not going into any large holes. That only makes them larger. Just into the V's. Now here's a funny one where I reattached my yarn and worked the second half of my sweater. I'm going to pick up one right here, and you'll notice I have my yarn attached here. If there are any little gaps, once I'm done knitting the neckline, I'll use this tail when I weave it in to close up those gaps as well. But same concept, I'm still picking up the V's, or within the V's. So it's the first clean looking stitch below the bind off. See how neat that looks there? Okay, so we're going across the front neck as established. Here I had that wide expanse of stitches that you'll often have in a crew neck, like a wide number of stitches that were bound off. So that reminds me very much of the back neck. But now here I'm at those stair steps again, and here those steps are going up. So I'm in this column here. My next column is this one. I'm going to trace it up and pick it up just below the bound off stitch. And keep repeating that anytime I get to a stair step. So again, I'm at a stair step. You don't want to go into the large holes. That only makes them larger. You're in this column of stitch. Boop. One over is right here. And I'm grabbing that. There's another stair step and one last stair step. So I guess I had some portions of just binding off one stitch here. Sometimes you'll decrease, sometimes it's bound off stitches. In this sweater I did lots of bind offs. Okay, and now I'm back here on the other side. You'll remember I picked up 10 stitches, so I want to get that same number here just so that I know I have that I've picked up an equal amount. I'm not going to pick up in this large hole. That will only make it larger, but I will pick up in the first one. So there's 1, 2, 3, whoop, 3, my yarn split there, skip a hole, 1, 2, 3, so now that equals 6 rows. I need to get 10, so I'm going to, or 6 stitches, I need 10, so I'm going to pick up 1 stitch in each of the next spaces. I'm not going to skip anymore. 1, 2, 3, and 4. So now here we go. I've got all of my stitches picked up. You'll notice I didn't really pay attention if my pattern called for a certain number to be picked up. I didn't necessarily follow that. I did what I knew was right in terms of the look of the stitches. Now I would join it in the round and work in my desired pattern. If your pattern requires a certain number of stitches to be completed, so in this case I'll be working a knit 1, purl 1 ribbing to match my cuffs. I'll want to make sure I have a multiple of 2 stitches. If you have something like a knit 2, purl 2 ribbing, you'll need to have a multiple of 4 stitches. So maybe you count before you begin, see what your stitch count is, and if you need to adjust it for any pattern you may have, you can increase or decrease on the next round as you begin. Happy knitting!